The GCI discussion-based pedagogy and philosophy aims to nurture critical thinking and exposure to a wide range of perspectives through discussion-based learning. This method convenes 12 to 14 students and a teacher around an oval table. The function of the teacher at the table is to be an advocate for the process being the conversation, the collaborative inquiry of an assignment. A teacher speaks only sparingly at the table. It is a shift from a teacher-centric process to student-centered learning, and that difference is profound. Once the students learn they have control over what happens to them in the classroom, they gain a deeper commitment to their own education. It also hones each student's ability to listen, collaborate, and provide constructive criticism in a diplomatic manner. A unique aspect of the program is that prior to the classroom sessions at the Global Citizens Youth Summit, a faculty member delivers a thought-provoking opening session called a plenary related to the daily theme of engagement, ethics, or excellence. The plenary session is a deep look into a real-life story. The content is unrelated to assigned readings, but the theme of which may serve as further scaffolding for future thought and conversation. After the session, students break into their smaller classroom groups and proceed with their roundtable discussion. One point to note is that the discussion-based learning of the GCI experience is a departure from the Socratic dialogue methodology. With the Socratic method, it is assumed that the teacher has the answer. But with the discussion-based learning, the students pose the question and discover answers together through a more personal and broader range of understandings and applications. In the next section of the video, Ms. Emer Page joins Ms. Molly Simmons for a conversation on discussion-based learning following 2 class observations.
Emer, thank you so much for letting me sit in on your 2 classes this morning.
You're welcome, Molly. It was great to have you there, and I'm looking forward to the chance to chat through how the classes went.
I loved how you started the entire class by, instead of jumping right into the material, kind of resettling the students into their new groups, kind of calming the energy after the plenary. With the rectangular tables we have here, there's the obvious issue of being able to see each other's eyes. So just taking the time to move back.
So we're going to make a start, but we're going to make a start by having a look around, and I think it's actually going to be Marius and Gianna and I who have the biggest job here to figure out that we have sight lines in the middle of the tables to everyone, and if we don't, to ask the people around us to pull in, pull out slightly, just making sure that you can make your eye contact with the whole table.
You know, really I feel like anything that settles students into the transition between the pre-class and the class is helpful. And I really was deliberately trying to get them to just sort of think consciously, can I see everyone? Because I want to see everyone, because this is going to be a marker of how we have our discussion together. Yeah, that was just the very first activity, but framing it and figuring out how everyone can see. Everyone was a deliberate move,
And then taking time to do a quick exercise. I think one of the frames you were talking about awareness, and in the second class you said an electric level of awareness, right? So that it's that reinforcement of the group conversation. And they did really well on the number countdown.
They were very pleased with themselves. So students knew that there was something they needed to say, and they actually had what they needed to say, but what they didn't have is the order. So they couldn't just do it around the room,
right?
Because that would have been way too easy. They had to really be aware of one another's bodies. And if 2 students spoke at the same time, they started again. Yesterday's exercise took us quite a while to get through.
I wondered.
We did get through it in both classes, so they had that sense of achievement. Maybe there was progress from yesterday. Maybe it was a simpler task. It was shorter. But also that was their last day together doing classes in this way, so I think they were really eager to demonstrate to each other that they could do this thing. So they both got it. It was really nice to see. They just had that little moment of levity as well before we moved into the text.
If you remember, last class we started with our alphabet game. We're going to do something along those lines to start off with today, but this time it's going to be a countdown, which means each of you is only going to get 1 number, right? So you can't finish it off. We're going to have to make sure we have all 14 voices. If you're not...
You're relieving the students at the beginning of the class from responsibility of thinking up their own words to say. You're giving them here's your script.
Mm-hmm.
Your script is the line of poetry, or your script is the letter of the alphabet or the number, and what you're doing is you're practicing just getting your voice into the mix and having people be aware of where you are in the discussion group. Yeah, I think it's helpful to have them. Again, we're still talking about the opening moments, just
Right.
the transition here.
And if we can't, we'll start again at 14. But if we do start again, we'll start with a different person. We're not keeping the same order.
14.
13,
12.
11,
10.
9,
8.
7,
6,
5,
4.
3,
2.
1.
Nicely done, guys. So that electric level of awareness of who hasn't spoken yet, who do we need to make space for at the table, let's try to keep some sense of that in the class as we go, because we were hyper conscious of there's a voice that's going to come from an area of the table that we haven't heard from yet, right? So let's see if we can keep some sense of that while also allowing ourselves, of course, to let the conversation flow. The other thing that we're going to do at the beginning of the class, which we didn't do yesterday, is you're just going to get into pairs for a few minutes. I want you to think of something that you would like to bring to the group discussion. What you're going to do is figure out, okay, what in this, or what idea that this generates for us, do we want to hear other people wrestle with? So you're coming up with a discussion question.
So I think it was just, in general, it was what, the first 5 minutes maybe of class. They come in, they focus, they know what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
the text is open, and then you paired them up and had them go.
Mm-hmm.
And those things are necessary to set the expectation that we want them to use the text.
Yeah, you really want them backing up their ideas with evidence. Otherwise, it all just becomes,
Yeah.
well, I believe, or in my opinion, and you don't really...
People think.
People think, yes,
Yeah.
it becomes too general. Yeah. But once you model for them across disciplines, rooting their ideas in evidence, then you start having students build up an awareness of how to make a persuasive argument.
Some schools and some teachers are asked continuously to check for understandings of learning, right? How do you know that your students are learning?
Mm-hmm.
And in discussion-based learning, that's a little bit harder to judge. And yet I find the easiest way to know if a student has done the reading is whether or not they can go to the text with their comments and evidence, or if they stay only in their own opinions. So I find, as a teacher, once you get that practice of hearing the types of comments students make, you get a sense of how they've interacted with the text, or for that matter, if they've done the reading.
Yeah, and then the other thing that comes into it, which we do need to gauge, dependent upon the group of students in front of us, is what is an appropriate reading length.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we have to, and there's no right answer to that. It depends on the difficulty of the material, the types of students, the amount of preparation time, the preparation expectations, the length of the discussion that they're going to have. But that's a hard question.
If we want them to do well, we need them to have the time and preparation to do
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So that's all kind of frame and
Setup.
setup.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you thought about going into these classes that we haven't touched on?
Oh, well, one of the things that I did try to do with the students in general before we even got into the classroom was give them a kind of range of the kinds of interjections, the types of things they might find themselves doing at the table. So that was, I hope, helpful for some who had not had experience in a discussion-based classroom. So they didn't feel that everything had to be a statement of
Right.
some major synthesis of ideas that they had come across in the text. They could introduce a new topic, they could make a connection with a speaker, a previous reading, or something that it reminded of them about in their own experience, which I'll come back to. This is, I think, particular to this kind of situation that we're in right now. They could affirm something another student had said. They could challenge something another student had said, although they needed to do that in such a way that it didn't undermine the self-confidence of that other student. They could ask a student for more information on something that they'd said. They could ask them to repeat a question, or they could help clarify something. They could make a citation or a textual comment, or they could do some summarizing. They could begin to attempt to synthesize two ideas and say, what so-and-so has said reminds me of this other thing. Are these two strands connected?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there are many other types of productive intervention or interjections that students could make in a discussion. I also talked with them about the kinds of behaviours that might derail us. So on that I had students, if their tone was dismissive, it was going to cause other students to be wary of entering. It would feel like an unsafe space.
Mm-hmm.
If the comments that they made were completely unconnected to anything else,
Mm-hmm.
that's a great way to derail things. If their tone was combative, so if in challenging someone else's idea they became argumentative, combative, if it becomes a back and forth between students, that's not particularly helpful. They could make a comment which is unsupported by the text or is just not related to the evidence in front of them. And then the other thing I was thinking was if they came up with an idea and they were digging their heels and they were unwavering in the way they put forward their determination, and they didn't let the other students' interjections mold their belief. All those can be ways in which the group gets stuck, derailed, or we sort of descend into something that is not collaborative meaning making. And then the final thing that I told the students about, and this was actually after talking with you and John, the other teachers in the program, was about silence, about owning silence, and about trying to discern, is this silence a silence because we've been struck deeply by something someone has said and we need some time to sit with it and think about it? Is it a silence because we're doing some processing in our head about everything that's happened and we've maybe encountered a new idea? Or is it a silence because maybe we've run out of steam, we're ready to move on, and whose responsibility is it in a discussion-based class to move on from a silence? And whoever's responsibility it is, I would argue strongly that it's not the teachers.
Right.
Particularly not in the early days, because if the teacher is the one to break a silence, then that becomes the role the students expect the teachers to take. So a teacher who is perfectly happy sitting in a silence where the students become increasingly uncomfortable is going to do better than a teacher who starts to squirm and feel, I must break this. And if you sit long enough, one of the students will come up with something.
I think we may never have a very vivid solution of this exact solution was implemented is going to reap the greatest effect.
Yeah, basically in agreement with that. I think the best way of being compassionate towards homeless people is to have a long-term support system.
Yeah, the other thing which I'm pretty sure you were picking up on was I was very aware of body language of some of those quieter students and trying to ask the other students, had they noticed a student trying to get in who was a little quieter? And so what you need to have really, ideally, is the body language of engagement, not the body language of closed off you and the text, not the disengagement from the table, but there's something that is a listening attitude that you want to see the kids in, and can be very helpful, specific feedback to give to a student.
Absolutely.
To say to them, I noticed that you're pulling back from the table, or I noticed that your tunnel vision on the text, and what I need you to be is looking around, and actually charge them with, next class, I want you to invite 2 to 3 quieter students. I don't want you to put them on the spot. I only want you to invite them if they've knocked the door, if they've leant in, if they've opened their mouths, but I want you hyper aware. What was the phrase I had?
Electric level of awareness.
An electric level of awareness.
Yeah, but that is it, right?
Language of
where
the others.
you know what's going on with everyone. Well, and there's a investment in everyone when you do that. There's an investment in the process. I wrote down your interventions, And some of them, I just included the beginning of the intervention and then ...
Yeah.
So I'll let you know. So you framed it with the sight lines and the numbers and opening of the text and the pairing. And then you started with who would like to begin? And then anyone else? Do you want to say a little bit more about... They are fearful of, and you clarified someone's point, that it's contagious was a kind of like a laughing moment, right? Like you were talking about fear. I think that is what Mako was saying about passivity. You were bringing her point back in. If we were to summarize what we've heard so far, and Masa, can you reiterate your question? Your comment shows us that when we start on one topic, we tag on all these other strings that begin to unfold. So what do we understand about empathy then? There was another, you made kind of like it was a joking comment, like is the purpose to make everyone homeless so we understand, you know? And that was laughter. So how do you define sympathy? What's the difference? And then you had Wumi, you kind of spoke just to her and you had her look up the definitions. You had said, what do you want us to do, Sydney? And then you kind of ended it. You had asked the question, what made you want to do this summit?
Yeah.
Right, was your last way to get other voices in to the conversation, and the final thing you said was, Carla, were you going to say something? Because I think you'd seen her going for it.
Yeah.
And then Carla, who had been listening all class and processing,
taking notes.
right, she makes the comments, if I don't act, who will?
Yeah.
And she didn't go on and on and on. She just said that and kind of looked around and sat back, and everyone was just kind of quiet. Like,
Well, couldn't that be a
yes.
slogan for this
Yeah.
kind of summit? If I don't act,
right?
who will?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just loved that it just, in some ways, it put everyone in their place. It grounded everyone in the why are we here.
Cool to think that people can say plural.
Carla, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I guess I can just speak for myself. I don't know about you guys, but for me, I came here because if I don't take action, I don't know who else will. You know?
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end, unless anybody has a final pressing thought that they'll feel, I missed my opportunity. All right, thanks, guys.
A couple of the times you noticed that what I was trying to do was introduce a little levity.
Yes.
Like the students will say something, they're on the cusp of saying something that can be pretty funny, or it's easy to turn it into something pretty funny. And without it ever being at a student's expense, it's great when there's laughter in a classroom.
Empathy is the ability to see yourself, to place yourself in this person's shoes. That's the meaning of empathy to me. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe a way that we could promote empathy for homeless people
Is to make everybody homeless? Oh, no, sorry.
is to, tell their stories.
I think you could tell too, that's not what he meant to say, but that was
Yes.
sort of where he was going. So
Then
some
he
of
was able
those
to clarify.
laughters, like when you do that, I think it's a help. It's kind of like a lifeline to the kid too, to
Steer away
you
from...
see them struggling a little bit,
Yeah.
and it's a kind of kind support
Yeah.
too.
The other thing that I'll do, and I know that most of us do this, is I'll model a lack of understanding in order to permit them to demonstrate a lack of understanding.
Right.
I'll say, and I'm not being, it's not purely performative. I do mean it when I say, this is really complicated, I don't get it, can you help me? Which I think gives permission for the students, maybe not in quite that way, but to say, this is confusing.
That's a great intervention, is let's define this so we're all on the same page. And if we're not, that helps us to clarify that we're not. So I was keeping track of who had spoken. And I knew that there were two students who hadn't spoken yet. And there hadn't seemed to be space for them yet to do that. And so when you needed a task, when we had sympathy and empathy, and you're like, all right, we got to define these. And it was the same thing. I was like, we need a dictionary here. We need someone to do this.
Yeah.
and we'd taken their phones away,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm sure many of them thought the same thing, but they didn't know if they had permission to ask her to do that. And so you kind of gave the permission to...
I gave my phone.
yeah, to the students who were engaged but hadn't been able to find a place for their voice
They can't
yet.
find for themselves. They can't do anything. Like, we need to baby them. It's exactly what they don't want. It's like the whole thing with the Camp Hill movement. Whereas in, like, if you're treating disabled people as like, oh, we need to hear disabled people's stories to be able to empathize with them, like, I think it goes so much beyond that, because you're basically just babying them, like making them less than human.
And I was aware of it because I was watching the table, but I don't think everybody at the table even knew that happened, even though they were across from you. It was just quick, and you were like, look it up. And they were like, okay, they were on it.
Like the difference between sympathy and empathy is that sympathy is seeing the pair of shoes, and empathy is being in the pair of shoes.
Wumi's going to help us out here because I've just given her a thumb.
So, sympathy, according to Google, it says that it's the feeling of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune.
So you see that.
All right, now to empathy. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feeling of another.
Exactly. In there.
Sympathy sounds more negative than...
No, sympathy is more passive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you
pity
see
them.
what's going
It's just
on.
acknowledgement.
You
You
walk
see-
by the guy and you
yeah.
say, wow, that
You
really
see
sucks.
outside
and
the
you keep
window.
going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Empathy.
What was the definition of empathy again?
Empathy
Ability
is
to
the
understand.
ability to understand and share the feeling of another
So you're in
person.
someone's shoes.
So you share, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you
Sympathy
ask
is
me-
seeing.
And they had the task right there. And what I loved is when one of them started reading the definition, someone tried to kind of cut in, someone tried to interrupt, and she was like, nope, okay, and now, right? There was strength, there was assertiveness, and so I think she appreciated the task, and her voice was strong. It was a great entryway.
And the information that she gave us then
necessary.
sustained the next,
Right.
I don't know how many minutes, but we ended up talking about the distinction she'd drawn our attention to
Yeah.
and using that for the next section of the discussion. But I think it's definitely worth, when you're having a discussion-based class, reminding the students that they do not need to channel their interventions through a central moderator in the form of the teacher. And the raising of hands is a way to use the teacher as moderator for who speaks next, for
Right.
the order of speeches. So one of the things that happens very quickly in my classroom and in most of the classrooms that I encounter these days is that students are accustomed to speaking to one another and of speaking just kind of in whatever sequence works.
I also found the minute, often it's because the teacher or facilitator has kind of posed the first question. And so the first person to answer is the one they're looking at you and they raise their hand. And, when you say, you don't need to do that, you said, put that hand down, Dan, all of a sudden you really feel the kind of the democratic feel of the table. There isn't someone who's going to call you out. Like, you are all responsible for one another. You are responsible for letting whomever enter the conversation. And so that power shift, I think, is a really important change in just the feeling of the discussion around the table. That no one gets to be the one who decides who speaks next.
When in my early days of teaching at Exeter, an older colleague in a faculty meeting made the point that the power lies in the hands of the questioner. And I actually did tell the students that story, even though I don't specifically remember telling them not to raise their hands. But I was saying to them, there's a difference between the Socratic method, where the teacher puts forward a set of guided questions in order to bring the students to an understanding.
Right.
And
A preconceived
or
a predecided understanding.
Which can be a very valid way of teaching, but this isn't what we're doing here. This is
Right.
where the students decide the direction of the material, and they decide the questions that are interesting ones to pose and answer. And the other piece that comes with that, as you say, if you pose the question, then the answer comes back to you. So what I try to do is have the beginning of class. My first question was, what did you say? It was, where do you want to begin?
Who would like to begin?
Who would like to begin?
Yeah.
I mean, that is not a question. Okay, somebody could say,
I do, right.
But that's not the beginning. So the beginning becomes something else. And hopefully what the students are doing then, if they're responding to the questioner, since the power then lies in the hands of that questioner, they're making eye contact with that questioner, because it's very difficult to have students not make eye contact with the teacher in the room if there's a teacher in the room.
Did anybody have something that came up there that they think would be a topic we should tackle in a larger group?
Yeah. So from talking to Kelsey, we came up like we think society treats homeless people to be like they're like a problem in society.
I found myself in my classes, and this is part of my own learning on how to be a good facilitator of these discussion-based classes, is when students were speaking and I can tell they're speaking to me, I actually either look down or look to see how other people are responding as opposed to looking directly at them, just to be aware or careful of what sort of affirmation they're looking for from me when I'm not judging them in that way. I'm not evaluating them in that way.
Yeah. So there are some strategies for that, but that's a real breakthrough when you see a student on day one who has been channeling everything through the teacher, and then a few days later you see them truly pulling in their peers and interested to see the expression on their peers' faces. And there is no problem at all with their peers nodding, and it's that you don't want the teacher to be the one that they're constantly looking for validation from. But if their peers are giving them those non-verbal cues that, wow, I'm really interested, that is in itself another kind of validation which they will end up seeking.
We had these 2 50-minute classes, and 50 minutes on, for one discussion may sound like a lot, but I find at the end of almost every 50-minute conversation, you're ending in the middle of ideas. It's just, it builds and builds, and it's difficult to cleanly wrap up a discussion. And so the way that you did a little bit differently in both classes, but with 3 to 5 minutes left, when it seemed like there was a good time to intervene or pause, you asked kind of in both cases, first of all, let's reflect on why you're here, right? This reading is called On Compassion. We're doing these local service projects. Reflect back on why you're here and your intentions, right?
But as I say, I think as long as you give them some sense of pulling together the strands, they could do anything and they'll walk away with a sense of completion. What you don't want is to just, it's out of time.
Yeah, they said, we're here for each other. Just look at the name tags.
Yeah.
Without conversation, there's no progress.
Yeah. Without conversation, there's no progress.
Yeah.
There you go. That's why we do discussion-based learning.
Yeah, I think Dan says it best when he talks about his inspiration for coming here, just talking to different people. Because I think that's what I know it's not over yet, but I think that's what I will have gotten out of this program more than anything, because design thinking is cool. All the speakers we've had talk to us, it's amazing, it's an amazing opportunity, but really why we're all here is because of each other, right? The opportunity to be in a room, like just look at the name tags. Isn't that cool? Just look at that. So I think that's why we're all here.
Without conversation, there is no progress. And I think that's what we, especially with the Harknesses, we've been able to keep the conversation alive. And that's amazing because that means we're going to keep progressing.
Love Fest, you guys are awesome.